All right, U.S. history students, we're going to move on into note 6.2, and we're going to look at the different characteristics of the Gilded Age, starting with immigration. So our first essential question is, what was immigration like during the Gilded Age? So from 1880 to 1921, a record 23 million immigrants arrived in the United States, primarily for economic reasons, looking for jobs and opportunities. At this time, prior to 1921, the United States did not place any quotas, which is a fancy way of saying limits on how many immigrants from a particular country could enter the United States, although this is going to change. Early immigration from the colonial era to 1880 saw that most immigrants came from Western Europe, England, Ireland, Germany, or Northern Europe, like modern-day Sweden, Norway, and Finland. After 1880, we're going to see a drastic change. 70% of all immigrants to the United States came from Southern and Eastern Europe, primarily of Italian, Polish, Austrian, and Russian descent. The quote-unquote new immigrants were typically young, male, and they were either Catholic or Jewish and spoke little to no English. The majority also were unskilled agricultural laborers with little money or education, meaning that they did not have a trade, and so they were looking for work in the newly industrialized cities on the East Coast. So most of the immigrants, 75% of all immigrants, are going to enter the United States through the Immigration Center at Ellis Island in New York. And if you look at this image here, you can see the Statue of Liberty in the foreground, and then in the background, you see the building that is Ellis Island. And then Ellis Island, we think of this Immigration Center here now where my cursor is, but also notice that there are other buildings around Ellis Island, and this is going to contain administrative offices, and also importantly, it's going to contain a hospital. In order to enter the country, immigrants had to meet some criteria. First, they had to pass a health examination, which was not like a doctor's visit that we think of today. Basically, they were given a very cursory look by a doctor. They would listen to their lungs. They might check to see if they have a temperature. If they looked sick or they looked like they would be unable to find employment upon entering the country, they were not allowed to stay in the country. And so what we saw, if someone was identified as having a potential health risk, we would see families broken up upon entry to the country. Inspectors would question immigrants to make sure that they were not criminals, that they had the ability to work, and at least had some money to get started in their life in the America, with the minimum being $25. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot to us today, but at the time, $25 was a fairly significant amount of money for an average unskilled European laborer. Once immigrants arrive in the United States, they faced a new form of discrimination called nativism. Nativism is the belief that America was for those born in America, and it was a very anti-immigrant view. Nativists view immigrants with a sense of fear, suspicion, and hostility. They have deep-seated prejudices about immigrants based on ethnicity, religion, and political and social beliefs. Many Americans at the time accused immigrants of taking jobs away from quote-unquote real Americans and called for quotas that would limit the number of immigrants. And so when you hear that, you might be thinking that this mirrors some of the discussions about immigration today, that we should be concerned about immigration because immigrants are going to take jobs that would otherwise be given to Americans who need employment. Our next essential question is, what were cities like in the Gilded Age? So when you look at this image, you can see that there are lots of people, there is lots of public transportation. If you look at this right here, you're going to see lumber, you're going to notice a lot of building going on. So there was a lot of movement and change happening in cities at the time. The Gilded Age is going to see massive urbanization, which is a fancy way of describing growth of large cities. In 1850, prior to the Civil War, only 15% of Americans lived in cities. By 1900, this is going to change. 40% of Americans are going to live and work in cities. City growth was due to rural Americans moving to cities and the immigrants who were entering the United States. Cities also are going to grow because of engineering innovations such as expansive bridges and skyscrapers that were made possible through the invention of steel and the Bessemer process, and is going to lead to the modern day city and the skylines that we see today with skyscrapers. And cities grow in a fairly predictable pattern. They expand outward from an industrial center. So if we look at Chicago, Chicago is a fairly good example. So we have a central business district. So before Chicago grew really, really large, most business was located in what was called the central business district. As the city grows in population, as it physically grows, it's going to grow outward from the center. And then is eventually going to result in a ring of suburbs where people will live and then commute into the city. As cities grew larger and you are no longer able to live near your work, you're going to see the development of trolley lines, and like right here you see what's called an elevated rail line, meaning the railroad tracks are above ground level, and subways were created to transport people from their homes to their jobs. But this growth happens very rapidly, and most cities are not equipped to deal with the rapid population growth. They don't have enough places for people to live. They don't have enough transportation. And so you see a lot of working class and lower class laborers living in buildings called tenements. And tenements are low rent apartments built in the poorest part of towns called the slums. And if you look at this blueprint, you can see that they would cram a lot of apartments into a small space, and then large families would live in these small spaces. So I think this picture gives you a really good representation of what living in a tenement was like. A lot of shared bedroom space, very tight and cramped living quarters. Because of the tight living quarters and unsanitary conditions at the time, many of the urban poor developed lung disease or tuberculosis, and about 60% of immigrant children die before their first birthday. Most of the immigrants will move directly to cities. About 2/3 of immigrants settled in cities such as New York, Chicago, Boston, or Philadelphia. And they tended to live with people who shared the same ethnic background. And these ethnically similar neighborhoods are called enclaves. And so if you travel to places like New York or Chicago, you're going to see neighborhoods like Little Italy. There are going to be Irish neighborhoods, Polish neighborhoods, where people with similar backgrounds decided that they wanted to live together because it creates a shared experience and it makes the move to a new country a little bit easier. Enclaves provided new immigrants with a sense of community and security, as the immigrants were surrounded by the familiar customs, food, and language of their homeland. So now that they're living in cities, the question is, what were working conditions like in the Gilded Age? So as you look at these three images, what do you think it was like to work in the newly industrialized factories, and what were those conditions like? So the majority of immigrants worked in industrial jobs, and industries were rapidly growing, and they needed a lot of cheap laborers. And since most immigrants were unskilled and willing to accept pretty much any kind of job, they were ideal employees, and they would take most jobs, no matter how unattractive or low paying the job might be. And since they take jobs that are low paying, and they take jobs that are that would be difficult or challenging, and they don't really know how to assert their rights, we find that they face a lot of problems during the Gilded Age. Eventually, they get tired of the low wages and long hours, and so they decide to create and join labor unions. And labor unions is a group of workers who come together to bargain for better working conditions, better pay, better hours, and they do this on the strength of their numbers. The larger a union is, the more powerful it is. Among the first labor unions in America was the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was open to all workers regardless of race, gender, or skill. Now, while the Knights of Labor was first, the most successful union was the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, which was led by Samuel Gompers. The AFL is different from the Knights of Labor in that it only included skilled workers, but it does also use collective bargaining to gain better pay, shorter hours, and better working conditions for its union members. So it limits who can join the AFL, but it uses the same tactics as the Knights of Labor. The AFL is extremely successful, but it does not include most workers. Only about 4% of workers are going to be able to join the AFL, and by the end of the Gilded Age, you see a really small number of American workers who belong to a union. One of the tactics used by unions to encourage collective bargaining was the strike. Strikes were designed to stop production in order to force management to accept union demands. And this map shows you the locations of the Great Railroad strikes in 1877. Business leaders resisted strikes by hiring replacement workers or private police to break up strikes. And as a result of either encounters between replacement workers or encounters between strikers and police, violence would often break out during this period. During the Chicago Haymarket strike in 1886, unionists demanded an 8-hour workday. And when violence breaks out, public opinion turns against the unions, viewing the union as violent and un-American. Violence also erupts in the Homestead strike in 1892 at Carnegie Steel Plant. Federal troops were called to reopen the factory with replacement workers. Railroad workers led a national strike in 1877 when the Pullman Palace Company cut wages by 50%. President Cleveland sent the army to end the strike, and strikers in 27 states resisted and dozens died. So the government does the worker faces problems in the Gilded Age, but so does government. The Gilded Age was an era of political corruption in national, state, and urban governments. Many city governments were run by political machines, and political machines were parties led by a very powerful boss who controlled a network of politicians. Machine politicians were able to rally citizens, especially immigrants, to vote for them by offering services. So it's kind of like buying a vote a little bit. Because machine politicians controlled access to city jobs, business licenses, and building projects, they tended to be very corrupt. And many politicians also used fraud to win elections, used their influence for personal gain, or took bribes. So a common phrase during this period when we think about fraud in elections is vote early and vote often. The most notorious urban politician was Boss Tweed of New York's Tammany Hall political machine. The Tweed ring defrauded New York City of millions of dollars until it was exposed by reporter Thomas Nast. And many government positions, such as tax collectors or post office officials, were appointed as rewards for loyalty to a political party called patronage. So kind of similar to Andrew Jackson's spoil system. But Congress intervenes and passes the Pendleton Act in 1883 that created merit-based exams for most civil service jobs in the federal government. In the Gilded Age, presidents were seen as much less powerful than monopolists and industry leaders like Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Rockefeller. So political power seems to be much less than industry power at the time. Grant was by far the most important president of the era, but his administration was plagued by scandals. The worst of these was the Credit Mobilier scandal, which involved bribes by railroad companies to gain land grants so that they could build railroad tracks. Another scandal, the Whiskey Ring, involved companies bribing government officials to avoid paying taxes. And this is going to put a really dark tone on Ulysses S. Grant's presidency. Now, while there were a lot of problems in the Gilded Age, one thing we do see in the Gilded Age is an increase in leisure time for some Americans. We see the development of competitive boxing, baseball, and other sports that would give people a way to escape working and living conditions. So while working and living conditions were difficult for poor immigrants, middle-class Americans saw their work time decrease. Many middle-class Americans fought off city congestion in their jobs by enjoying amusement parks, bicycling, vaudeville theater, which is a fancy term for like variety shows, and sports such as baseball and boxing. During the Gilded Age, we see that the United States was a land of opportunity for some. The Industrial Revolution creates jobs and factories on the East Coast. Millions of new immigrants come to the United States from Eastern and Southern Europe, swelling American cities, although creating problems with living conditions. Urbanization stimulated industry and modernized cities, but led to terrible conditions for poor workers and immigrants. And then as you look at this chart, the last thing I want you to think about is identify the top 5 changes of the Gilded Age, rank order, and be ready to explain your list.